Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. Today we're doing a cutting board giveaway and we're going to show you how to make it. Stay tuned later in this episode to find out how you can win this, but right now I'm just going to be voicing over the whole process of how to make a cutting board like this so that even if you don't win this cutting board, you can make one for yourself. All right, let's go. So the first step to making your cutting board is to choose a piece of wood that you want to make it out of. It needs to be clear, which means that there shouldn't be knots, voids, or other defects, and then cosmetically you want to make sure that it has the grain structure and look that you want to have on your cutting board. You also want to make sure that you're using hardwoods for your cutting board because softwoods absorb too much water and have too much opportunity for bacterial growth. In my case, I chose to do a primarily maple board with some walnut inlays. Here, I'm doing one final check over the wood to see where it is clear and what type of grain structure I want to have in my cutting board. Sometimes the length of your cutting board will be dictated by what is actually present in the wood. Once you have your wood picked out, go ahead and get your rough dimensions laid out. See about how wide your piece is, know the limitations on your planer and your miter saw and any of the other equipment that you have in the shop, and get planning for what you can build out of this. Now it does help to have somewhat of a plan going into it, but understand that this may change depending on what you find in the wood. In my case, I wanted the dimensions of my cutting board to match the golden ratio. If you're not sure what the golden ratio is, go ahead and Google it. It's pretty cool, but essentially it's just a ratio of dimensions that looks really good to the human eye. After doing all of those checks and finalizing the dimensions, go ahead and mark out your wood for the next cut. Make sure to leave yourself a little bit of space on either end because you're going to want to cut off the ends of your cutting board before you finish it. This step doesn't need a whole lot of explaining. Once you have your boards marked, cut them down to length. And as always, make sure to use the proper PPE. Next, we're going to figure out what subcuts are needed inside of each one of these so that we can put the cutting board together. Next up, you're going to make those subcuts, and you can do this either on a bandsaw or on a table saw, but I chose to use the bandsaw because it has a smaller kerf, which means I lose less of my nice hardwoods when I'm cutting these down to size. We'll just speed these up a little bit. Now that all your pieces are cut to the right size, you want to make sure that everything lines up and you can start orienting them the way that you want. Checking for the grain and doing kind of the final check to make sure that it's all oriented the way that you'd like it to be in the final cutting board. Something you're also checking for here is how flush each one of the faces fits to each other. Sometimes you can get it pretty close on your bandsaw so you don't need to do an aggressive job jointing it. Other times, like in my case, I did not cut it straight and so I needed to joint more aggressively. You'll notice that I'm using my rider table as a jointer. This is totally possible, but if you have access to a jointer, go ahead and use that. To make sure you've got a good snug fit on your cutting board, you want to follow the general process to square up two of your faces and then take it over to the planer to make sure that you've got the right thickness all the way across. If you've got thin pieces, make sure that you're very careful when you're using your tools on both the planer and on the jointer. Taking a second to put my router into jointing mode, one of the interesting things about this is Bosch included the ability to add a shim behind that left sheet of MDF so that you can set this up as a jointer, which works really handily for small pieces. Now we'll just quickly get everything jointed. And then go ahead and get everything planed down to the right thickness. And then you're going to want to do one final last grain check to make sure that everything is oriented exactly the way you want it before you glue it up, because once it's glued, there's no going back. Once the last minute double checking is done, go ahead and get everything set up ready to glue. For this cutting board, I'm using Titebond 3. Not because I specifically had to use Titebond 3, I have heard that you can also use Titebond 2 as well, which is water resistant instead of waterproof like Titebond 3. However, I needed Titebond 3 for a separate project, so that's why I chose to use it in this one. As with all wood glue, you want to make sure that you lay out a nice thick bead and spread it out evenly. I just recently got this Rockler silicone glue brush, which makes it really easy to spread the glue evenly across the surface. And cleanup is a breeze because you can either wash it out immediately or let it dry and then just pull the wood glue out of the bristles. Now to clamping. You're going to want to make sure that you clamp it nice and tight, but also go slowly so that you can make sure that everything is aligning well. Any misalignments that you get are going to have to be planed off in the end, which reduces the thickness of your board quite substantially depending on how much misalignment you have. After you have everything clamped together, make sure to let it sit for the allotted amount of time as specified by either your Titebond 2 or Titebond 3 bottle. In my case, I let it sit overnight. You really just want to make sure that it can get up to full strength or nearly full strength so that when you start working on it today, you don't risk breaking one of those bonds. Next up, you're going to want to send this through the planer a couple of times. One of the things to keep in mind if you have the default straight blades on your planer is that it can tear up some of the figured grain within your boards. So you really want to be careful and watch which grain and which direction you're putting into your planer so that you reduce the amount of tear out. It also helps if you put it on the finishing setting because it moves it through a little bit slower, which means that you're not going to get nearly as much grain tear out. The golden solution to all of this is to get one of the Helix spiral cutting heads, which has individual carbide bits in a helical pattern, and so you're not actually coming across most of the grain pattern, you're cutting it at an angle, which reduces tear out a bunch. I do not have one of these yet, but it is high on my upgrade list. Out of the planer, and boy is this thing looking good. I'm super excited to see how well it's coming along, and there's only a couple of steps left. Next up, you're going to go ahead and cut it down to the final length or nearly the final length that you want. I usually start this by cleaning up one edge by taking off hardly anything or taking off the minimum that I can off of that one side depending on what defects are present, and then go to the other side after measuring so that I get the final dimension that I'm looking for. Once everything is trimmed down to size, it's time to put some finishing touches on the cutting board. In this case, I'm going to use the corner round to round off all of the edges all the way around. One tip for this process is to start with the end grain because you're going to get tear out on the edge that you're concluding on almost regardless of what you try to do. When you end on the long grain, it allows you to clean all of that up because your depth of cut is usually beyond whatever tear out occurred. There we go, only 2 more small steps remaining, and man do I love how this looks. Next step is to sand the whole thing, and I'm just going to speed us through this because sanding is not really all that interesting regardless, but I start with an 80 grit to knock down everything, but you've got to be really careful because that 80 grit's pretty aggressive. Then I go to a 120, and then I go to a 220. Now, one of the secrets to a super smooth cutting board, even when the cutting board itself is wet, is to get it wet first, and then go back and do another sanding at the 120 grit. This allows the grain to raise up for anything that's absorbing the water. You just kind of let this sit for a couple of seconds and then dry it off with a paper towel, get back to sanding, and that knocks down all of those high spots. And then last but not least, my favorite part, and I'm pretty sure it's every woodworker's favorite part, is oiling the cutting board or oiling the workpiece. For cutting boards, there are a lot of really fancy things that you can coat them with, but I choose to use 100% food grade mineral oil because it both keeps the cutting board moist and inhibits bacterial growth. Well, I'm going to let you guys sit here for a few seconds and enjoy this because this is honestly one of my favorite parts about the entire project. Well guys, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I am thrilled with the way that this guy turned out, and I learned 2 primary things. One, when you're doing your jointing and planing, joint your 2 faces first and then plane it. I incidentally kind of went through and ended up jointing more than that, which does not give you parallel faces, and so I had one piece that was shaped like a wedge. The sides were flat, but it was shaped like a wedge. So that reduced the thickness of my pieces a little bit. And 2, that kind of feeds into this one. When you're jointing and planing, it took off more than I had anticipated, and so I am going to be budgeting more width later in future cutting boards so that I can keep the width that I want towards the end, because I originally budgeted for this to be an 8-inch by about 13-inch, and it turned out to be much closer to 7 inches when I got all of that processing done. But for now, the moment that you've all been waiting for, how to enter to win the cutting board. So all you have to do to win this cutting board is comment on the video with something that you learned and subscribe to the channel. On January 2nd, I'm going to go ahead and do a drawing to find the winner or to choose the winner of this cutting board, and we'll get in touch and I'll make sure that I get that shipped off to you guys. So Merry Christmas, you guys. Have a Happy New Year, and I will see you next time.